Good evening, everyone. My name is Curtis Jackson. I'm the co-president of the University of San Diego Black Law Student Association. And it is with great pleasure and enormous thanks to Dean Stephen Ferrulo and the University of San Diego School of Law, as well as Kleinden's PC law firm, that I'm here tonight to introduce this fascinating and timely event. We are so excited to have with us tonight Mr. Richard Rothstein to present his powerful and disturbing book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History, How Our Government Segregated America. Mr. Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, as well as a senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and a senior fellow at the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and as I just found out, he's also retired. Mr. Rothstein is also a leading authority on housing policy within the United States and how local, state, and federal housing policies have mandated segregation and undermined the ability of African Americans to own homes and build wealth in America. As is laid out in his book with an overwhelming amount of evidence and support, these decade-old housing policies have had a lasting effect on American society and has contributed to the persistent racial unrest we see today. Since being published nearly a year ago, The Color of Law has been heralded as a Publishers Weekly Top 10 book of 2017 and was longlisted for the National Book Award. And after this presentation, if anybody's interested in purchasing his book, we're going to be having a reception at the Grand Terraza patio where his books will be for sale, and he's let us know that he will be able to sign copies if you're interested. And we couldn't be more thrilled to have Mr. Rothstein here in San Diego, and I would be very grateful if you would help me welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, Curtis, and thanks to all of you for coming here this evening to engage in this conversation with me. As you all know, in the 20th century, this country made the decision to abolish racial segregation. We decided it was wrong. We thought it was immoral. We knew it was harmful to both African Americans and to whites, and we understood that racial segregation was unconstitutional. And we began actually by eliminating racial segregation in law schools. That was the first place that it was challenged. The NAACP challenged segregation in law schools because it figured that if judges were too stupid to understand anything else, they could understand you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. So they won that case, and then they built on that to challenge segregation in higher education of all kinds, graduate schools, undergraduate schools. Then in 1954, as you know, we abolished racial segregation in elementary and secondary schools with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement grew, and the pressure grew enough that we abolished segregation in everything from buses to lunch counters to public facilities to water fountains. We abolished all these forms of segregation, and yet we have left untouched the biggest segregation of all, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is segregated by race, residentially. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in has had clearly defined areas which were all or almost all white, and clearly defined areas which are all or almost all African American. And we accept this as part of the natural environment. We think that racial segregation is just the way things are. Even though we made this commitment, this national commitment, that segregation is wrong, immoral, harmful, and unconstitutional, we don't seem to be fazed by the fact that neighborhoods are segregated everywhere. It's not that we've tried to desegregate them and failed. We haven't even tried. There's been no effort in this country to address the issue of residential segregation. We have some people concerned with housing for low-income people and other forms of reforms like that, but not segregation itself. And I think the reason that we haven't addressed it is not all that hard to understand, at least in part. It's a lot harder to desegregate neighborhoods than it was to desegregate all these other institutions that we desegregated in the 20th century. If we desegregate water fountains, the next day you can drink from any water fountain. If we desegregate buses, the next day you can ride anywhere on a bus, sit anywhere on a bus. But if we desegregated neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so, because it's more difficult to desegregate neighborhoods than it is to desegregate any of the other institutions that we attacked segregation in the 20th century, we've adopted a rationalization, a myth, a national myth. And it's a myth that is so widely held that there's virtually no dissent to it. It's held by conservatives as well as liberals. It's held by blacks as well as whites. And we have a name for that myth. We say that unlike all the other kinds of segregation that we attacked, residential segregation is de facto. It sort of happened by accident. The other segregations were all government-sponsored. There were laws that enforced them and put them in place, but residential segregation sort of grew naturally. It happened because, some homeowners wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe real estate agents or banks discriminated in their private capacities. Or maybe blacks and whites just happen to want to live with one another. They like living in homogeneous neighborhoods. Or maybe there are just income differences that keep African Americans from moving into middle-class neighborhoods that are mostly white. All of these individual, non-governmental decisions is what created residential segregation. And the Supreme Court has said that if we have this kind of accidental segregation, something that just evolved naturally, de facto we call it, not only shouldn't we do anything about it, we're prohibited under the Constitution from doing something about it, from enacting conscious, explicit policies to desegregate something that the government wasn't involved in creating. Well, I spent, before I became a retired guy, I spent most of my time writing about education policy. And I was very concerned about school segregation because there's no way we can close the achievement gap between African American and white children as long as they're all in segregated schools. If you have schools where you concentrate the most disadvantaged children, no matter how good the school is and how well trained the teachers are, you can't get the same kind of achievement than you can from a school where children come well rested and well fed and in good health with high quality early childhood experiences and so forth. If you concentrate children without all those things, you can't really accomplish what we want to accomplish in schools. And we call those schools segregated schools, and schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. In fact, schools are more segregated today than they have been any time in the last 45 years because of neighborhood segregation. Well, as I was studying education policy, I came to read a case that maybe some of you who are lawyers are familiar with. It was a 2007 case in which the Supreme Court evaluated a policy of two school districts. One was Louisville, Kentucky, the other was Seattle, Washington. And both of those districts had enacted a very, very modest school desegregation plan. They understood what I said a few minutes ago, that you could not really deal with the challenges the school faced so long as schools were segregated. And the plan involved a choice system where parents particularly of adolescents themselves could choose which high school in the district they would go to. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would minimize segregation. So if you had, for example, an all-white or almost all-white high school, and there was one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for that place, the black child would be given some preference because that child would help to desegregate the school. And the Supreme Court was horrified about this policy. They said it was unconstitutional. And the reason they said it was unconstitutional was because the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. It was a decision, I should say, by a plurality decision by Chief Justice Roberts. The schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. That was a pretty wise observation on his part. But then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle were segregated without government involvement for all the accidental reasons that I just described. And he went on, it's well established that if you have a situation that government wasn't responsible for creating, it would be unconstitutional for the government to acknowledge it and enact self-conscious policies to desegregate those neighborhoods, or the schools in those neighborhoods. And as I say, this case was arose out of the school districts of Louisville and Seattle. And what can you hear me if I stand up? This microphone, yeah? Okay, I'm going to do that. Thank you. The case was from Louisville, Seattle, and Seattle, Washington. And I remembered in reading this case that of a situation I read about in Louisville, Kentucky. Some years ago, many years before the case was handed down, in which a white homeowner in a single-family home suburb of Louisville called Shively had an African-American friend who was a decorated Navy veteran, a middle-class fellow. He had his own, I think he was a small businessman, middle-class income. And he had a daughter, a wife and daughter, and he wanted to find better housing for his family. They were living in the Louisville segregated area, and he wanted to move to a single-family home in the suburb, and nobody would sell one to him. So the white homeowner, who was his friend in the suburb of Shively, bought another house in that suburb and then resold it to the African-American. And when the African-American family moved in, a mob surrounded the home, surrounded by the police and protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. I have pictures of some of the violence in my book, The Color of Law. They dynamited the home. They firebombed it. And when this riot was over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. If the mere fact of selling a home to an African American in a white neighborhood gets you a 15-year jail sentence for sedition. And I knew a little bit more than that, but I began to wonder whether there was a systematic, whether this government policy that made racial segregation of neighborhoods not just the product of isolated government support, but a systematic government policy that was just as powerful as the government rules that segregated the other institutions that we addressed in the 20th century, and whether in fact we don't have de jure segregation of neighborhoods that's just as unconstitutional as the segregation of water fountains or buses or lunch counters. And so that's how this research began, and what I concluded was indeed we have a collection of policies that were so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape of today. Many policies followed by federal, state, and local governments to ensure that African Americans and whites could never live near one another in any significant numbers. And as I say, with policies that all interrelated, they reinforced each other and were so powerful that they explain why we have racial segregation today, and we've never remedied them. And the reason I think this book is so important, I guess that's easy for me to say, I wrote it, but the reason that this history is so important is because unlike most history, which is a merely academic interest, this history determines what we can and can't do about the problem. Because so long as we think that the government had no role or a minimal or insignificant role in the segregating of neighborhoods, then we can't enact policies to address it. But if we understand that we have an unconstitutional system of government-created, supported, and required racial segregation, then as American citizens we're obligated under the Constitution to remedy it. So let me describe some of the major policies that the government followed to create racial segregation everywhere. I won't have time to describe them all, but I think I'll describe enough that you can I think I'll be able to persuade you that we do have an unconstitutional system of racial segregation that demands a remedy. The first one I want to talk about is public housing. Now, we all think we know what public housing is. Public housing, I'm sure you all think, is a place where poor people live. Lots of mothers, single mothers with children. lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, acting out in the informal economy and engaging in illegal activity and disorderly activity and attracting the attention of the police. That's what we think of as public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for which poor people weren't even eligible. It was a program for working class families who could afford to pay the full cost of their housing in their rent. Public housing wasn't subsidized. The government built it, but it recouped all the costs and the rent of the people who lived there, working class families. It began in the New Deal in 1933 during the Franklin Roosevelt administration as an anti-depression measure, and it was designed, as I say, for working class families who could afford housing, but there was no housing being constructed in the Depression. There was a big housing shortage, and constructing the housing was a good way of providing jobs as well. And that was the basis of the initial public housing program. And the federal government, the Public Works Administration, which was one of the first agencies that was established in the New Deal when Roosevelt took office, built the first public housing in this country for civilians. And it was always segregated. Everywhere it was built, it was segregated. Frequently, and this is the important point to remember, frequently segregating neighborhoods that previously were integrated. Now, that may surprise you, but in the early mid-20th century, there were many, many integrated neighborhoods. I don't know if any of you happened to read just the other day the obituary of Linda Brown, one of the children who her father was one of the plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. And in the New York Times obituary, I just noticed this paragraph that said that Linda Brown lived in an integrated neighborhood. This was in the 1940s, 30s and 40s. Her playmates were of white and Asian and black. She went to a segregated school. The school was segregated, but the neighborhood was integrated. And in the mid to early 20th century, there were many, many urban areas that had integrated neighborhoods for the simple reason that working class families didn't have automobiles to get to work. And so if you had a downtown area where most of the jobs were, and there was residential areas surrounding that downtown area, African Americans and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants and Jewish immigrants and rural migrants all had to live in roughly the same neighborhoods because they had to walk to work, to the same workplaces. Maybe they could take short streetcar rides. There were streetcars everywhere at that period of time. But this was an extraordinary, and this was even in the South. The South may have segregated water fountains and buses and lunch counters, but it didn't segregate neighborhoods for the same reason. You had to be able to get to workplaces and live close enough to one another to work in the same workplaces. Some of you may remember or have read the autobiography of Langston Hughes, the great African-American poet, novelist, and playwright. It's called The Big C. Have any of you read it? No. It's worth reading. Do you remember that he grew up in a Cleveland neighborhood that was integrated? He says his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was the central neighborhood of Cleveland. It's not what we think of when we think of downtown Cleveland now, as being an integrated neighborhood where African-American young men have best friends who are Polish and date Jewish girls. But that's what the central area of Cleveland was at the time, and the Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood to create two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation that was entirely unnecessary because the neighborhood previously had been integrated, and which established a pattern that directed the future growth of Cleveland for decades to come. And this happened all across the country. In my book, I like to talk about places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, because everybody thinks of these as very liberal places. And I figure if I can show you that the government did this even in those places, you'll probably more easily understand that it happened everywhere. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area near MIT called the Central Square neighborhood. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was about half black and half white. The federal government demolished housing in that neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cambridge and in the Boston area that persists to this day. Even in the South, in Atlanta, There was an integrated area, about half black and half white, called the Flats near downtown Atlanta. Government demolished housing there, built a public project for white families only. The African Americans who lived in the neighborhood were evicted and had to double up elsewhere with families or relatives, or find less adequate housing, creating both to their impoverishment and to the establishment of residential segregation in Atlanta. The process became even more exacerbated during World War II, when hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in the war industry. There had been a big shortage of jobs, as you know. That's what the Depression was, high unemployment. It was World War II that brought the Depression to an end, that gave us full employment for the first time because of the war production. And hundreds of thousands of workers came to places where there had been no production before and needed a place to live. In my book, again, I say I like to focus on places like this. In my book, I focus on a suburb of Berkeley. It's called Richmond, just north of Berkeley, California. It was the center of shipbuilding in the West Coast. There was no shipbuilding going on in Richmond prior to World War II. But by the end of World War II, there were 100,000 workers working in the Richmond shipyards. Originally, the shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards would only hire white workers, but when the supply of white workers was exhausted, they sent recruiters throughout the South to bring African Americans to Richmond to work in the plant because the government demanded that they produce the ships. Richmond itself was a small suburb, as I say, of Berkeley. It had a population of about 20,000, all white. There were a tiny handful of African Americans living in the outskirts of Richmond and working as domestics in white families' homes, but it was not a segregated community. It was basically a white community. If you consider the families of and spouses of these war workers, we're talking about an influx of population of 400,000 people. How does a community of 20,000 absorb 400,000 in just the period of 4 years? It's you're interested in urban studies and planning. How do you do that? How do you absorb 400,000 people from a base of 20,000? It's inconceivable. But the government demanded that those ships be built, and so it had to build housing for these workers. And it built segregated housing in a community, in a whole area that had never known segregation before. The San Francisco Bay Area and most of California had very few African Americans before World War II. Unlike eastern cities that experienced what we refer to as the first great migration of African Americans who came north during World War I and after, that wasn't the experience of California. It was the second great migration during World War II that brought a large African American population to California. And so there was no segregated patterns beforehand. The government built housing in Richmond for the black workers along the railroad tracks in the industrial area near the waterfront. It built temporary housing because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans who came to Richmond to work in the war industries during the war would have to leave when the war ended. And it built permanent housing for the white workers in the white residential areas east of the city, in the eastern part of the city, creating a segregated pattern where it had never previously existed and where it never otherwise would have existed. And we have, in this particular case, what social scientists call an existence proof that it was completely unnecessary. Because although this was done all over the country, the federal government segregating housing for war workers, even they were working together, you know, in the defense industries, but segregating their housing. But we have one example of an integrated housing development that worked well. And that was also, it happens in the San Francisco Bay Area. There was another shipyard called Marin Ship in Marin City across the Golden Gate Bridge. And that shipyard ramped up production so rapidly as the war came closer that the administrators had no time to segregate housing. They built barracks for single men. Families couldn't come, and they just handed out pillows and blankets as the workers showed up. And the barracks were accidentally integrated. People just took whatever beds were available. And it worked out so well that when the families arrived and the city of Marin City built housing for the families as well, they built it on an integrated basis because there was no reason not to. Proving that the policy that the government was following elsewhere was entirely unnecessary, even if you try to rationalize it by saying it was a war measure of some kind. Well, this public housing program, both in the New Deal and then during the war, created patterns of segregation everywhere. In 1949, there was still an enormous housing shortage in the country. Not only had no housing been built in the private sector during the Depression, but during World War II was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes. It could only be used, you could only build housing for war workers. So there was a big backlog of housing for that reason. And then you had millions of returning war veterans coming home after the war, forming families, having the baby boom, needing housing, doubling up with relatives and living in Quonset huts and open fields, an enormous housing crisis. President Truman, who succeeded President Roosevelt upon Roosevelt's death, proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program in the country. And remember, we're talking not about poor people. These were returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war boom, but there was no housing for them. So President Truman proposed a vast new public housing program, and conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat this program. They wanted to defeat the program not because for racial reasons. It was segregated. They were quite comfortable with that. It's not that they didn't like poor people. The housing wasn't for poor people. It was for people with jobs who could afford housing, but for whom there was none available. They wanted to defeat it simply because they thought ideologically that the government shouldn't be building housing. It was socialistic, and the private sector should be taking care of it, even though the private sector wasn't taking care of it. And so they came up with a strategy in Congress, which is a key point in this history. And that is, they came up with a poison pill strategy. I don't know if you're familiar, if you've heard that term. But a poison pill strategy is a legislative device that opponents of a bill employ by proposing an amendment which seems to be innocuous, a poison pill amendment. And people vote for it, and it passes. And then once the amendment is attached to the bill, combined with the rest of the bill, it makes the bill unpalatable to a majority, and the bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress in 1949 proposed an amendment to Truman's 1949 Public Housing Act. From now on, the amendment said, public housing has to be integrated. No more discrimination in public housing. It has to be an integrated program. Of course, it was a cynical proposal. They didn't really care about integration. But their theory was that they would vote for this amendment. Northern liberals would join them in voting for the amendment, creating a majority support. And then when the full housing bill came up before the floor of Congress, the conservatives would flip and vote against the housing bill that had their amendment on it. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who would also vote against a program that was integrated, and the bill would go down to defeat. So, get this. This is the important thing to remember. Northern liberals campaigned against the integration amendment. They were led by the leading civil rights advocates in the United States Senate. I see some of you are old enough to remember Hubert Humphrey. He was the leading civil rights advocate in the Senate. He made a name for himself by insisting on a civil rights platform in the Democratic Party platform in the 1948 convention, the year before. He led a campaign against the integration amendment. He succeeded. The integration amendment, he persuaded the Northern liberals to vote against integration in public housing in order to save public housing itself. He was joined then by Southern Democrats who also voted against the amendment. The amendment failed. The full bill came up before Congress with a majority support of both Northern liberals and Southern Democrats who were happy to have it so long as it was segregated. And the bill passed. And the federal government used that vote in 1949. You know, to me, that's not so long ago. Maybe to you it seems like ancient history, but, you know, Jackie Robinson was already on the Brooklyn Dodgers by then. In 1949, the federal government used this vote to preserve segregation in public housing as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. Under this bill, the 1949 Housing Act, much of the public housing that we become familiar with or became familiar with as symbols of public housing, things like the giant Robert Taylor homes in Chicago or Cabrini Green, or in St. Louis, the Pruitt-Igoe Towers. Pruitt-Igoe Towers, of course, was two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans and Igoe was for whites. And let me make clear, I know I don't need to tell you this, but it's not because African Americans happen to want to apply to Pruitt because they like to live with one another, and whites happen to apply to Igoe because they like to live with one another. These were explicitly designated projects, as were all the ones that I talked about so far, explicitly designated by race. And these projects were built, and very shortly afterwards, in the early 1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was similar, quite surprising, unexpected, and uniform everywhere. And that is that the African American designated projects, like the Pruitt project in St. Louis, had long waiting lists. And the white designated projects, like the Igoe project in St. Louis, had large vacancies. And this happened everywhere. And it was surprising because all the residents of public housing had incomes. They all were working in the post-war boom. This was not yet for poor people. Why was it that the African American waiting lists were long and the white projects had vacancies? I mean, it became so conspicuous after a while that the government had to open up the African American designated, the white designated projects rather, to African Americans. You couldn't have projects, one with long waiting lists and the other with big vacancies. And the projects increasingly became almost all African American. About the same time, industry left the cities where these projects were located. They started to move to rural areas and suburbs because the highways were being built and it was no longer necessary to have a factory near a deep water port or near a downtown railroad terminal. So the people living in public housing, who are now mostly African American, became poorer and poorer. Soon the projects had to be segregated, had to be subsidized because the people who were living in them couldn't afford the rent, to pay their rent. And we got the kind of public housing that we know today as a program for poor people. That's not how it happened. But the question is, why did all the white projects have these vacancies and the black projects not have them? And that was primarily because of another federal program that was even more powerful than the public housing program. And that was a program by the Federal Housing Administration that was designed explicitly to get the white population to move out of cities into single-family homes in white-only suburbs. And I say this explicitly, this was a racial policy of the federal government. It wasn't just an economic policy, it was a racial policy to get white families out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. After I wrote this book, I came across a poster that the Federal Housing Administration had produced during World War II, which showed a black man being led away in handcuffs by the police, and the headline in the poster was "Escape Crime, Move to the Suburbs." This was the federal propaganda campaign. But it wasn't just propaganda. There was a lot of money behind it, and the way it worked was this. Under this program, the large, giant subdivisions in every city in the country that we're familiar with were built. Places, the most famous one is probably Levittown, east of New York City. You've probably heard of that one. In California, I don't know much about, I'm supposed to know about every single area in the country, and I apologize, I don't. I'm sure there are suburbs like this in San Diego. I don't know their names, but I do know, for example, in California, some of you may remember hearing a song that Malvina Reynolds wrote that Pete Seeger used to sing about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was about an FHA, Federal Housing Administration, subdivision created south of San Francisco in Daly City. Los Angeles became the symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s in the country, and places like Lakewood or Westchester or Panorama City, all of these were FHA subsidized projects for white families only to get whites to move out of urban areas. The way it worked was this: someone like Levitt, who was the builder of Levittown, or Henry Dolger, who built the little boxes on the hillside, or Mark Taper, who built the Lakewood development, they could never have assembled the capital to build these giant subdivisions on their own. Levittown was 17,000 homes. Where does a builder get the money to buy the land and build 17,000 homes before he's made a single sale? It's inconceivable. The only way he could do it, and no bank would lend him the money for such a venture, the only way he could do it was by going to the federal government, submitting his plans for the development, including the architectural design, the materials he was going to use, the setback from the street and the street layout, and an explicit commitment never to sell homes to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration even required these developers, and they're still there today, to include deeds in every home, clauses in deeds of every home in these subdivisions that prohibit resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And as I say, these clauses are still in the deeds today. They're not enforceable any longer, but they're still in the deeds. And with that commitment, Levitt and the other builders could go to a bank and get a guaranteed loan to buy the land and to hire the builders and to build 17,000 homes in Levittown, or 15,000 in Lakewood, or any of these other suburbs. And they were in every city in the country. The subsidy was so great, the incentive was so great, that white families could move out of public housing where they were living and into these family homes that the FHA was subsidizing and pay less than their monthly housing costs for their housing in the single-family homes than they were paying for rent in public housing before they moved out. This was, I say, I want to emphasize this again, an explicit racial program. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual which was distributed to appraisers across the country that guided appraisers in what kinds of projects, what kinds of developments they could approve for these federal guarantees. And the underwriting manual said that the projects could be approved only if they were for the same racial class. Not that there were projects being approved for the other racial class, but they had to be for the same racial class. And projects couldn't even be approved if they were near African American neighborhoods, because then they would run the risk of infiltration by incompatible racial elements. This was the language in the written federal manual that guided appraisers. There was one case, I describe this in my book. I actually have a picture of it. In Detroit, a developer proposed to build houses for white families only, just like the FHA required, but the FHA said that his proposed development was too close to an African American neighborhood. So they approved the loan only after he built a 6-foot-high wall, concrete wall running half a mile long to separate his development from the nearby African American neighborhood. And I have a picture of that wall in my book. And on that basis, the FHA gave him the loan. I'll tell you one more story, a California story. Still Northern California, I apologize. I mentioned Banks and Hughes before. I like to talk about novelists. Another one is Wallace Stegner. Have you ever read a Wallace Stegner novel? He won the Pulitzer Prize for Angle of Repose. But before World War II, he wrote an autobiographical novel called Big Rock Candy Mountain. It got a lot of attention. And so on that basis, Stanford University recruited Wallace Stegner to teach writing immediately after the war. And at that time, professors were working class people. They were paid very modest salaries. It's not like today where professors are paid exorbitant, indefensible salaries. They were modest salaries, and he couldn't find any housing for himself and his family. So he got together with other lower middle class families. Others were tradespeople and postmen and school teachers. They formed a cooperative of 150 families, and they bought a large tract of land outside of Stanford University, with the intention of building 400 middle-class homes in this area. They went to the local banks, and the banks wouldn't give them any loans to proceed with the project because the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't guarantee the loans, and the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't guarantee the loans because of the 150 families in this cooperative, 3 were African American. And that was a disqualifying factor so far as the Federal Housing Administration went. So Stegner and his fellow leaders of the cooperative eventually had to disband the cooperative. They sold the land that they had bought to a private builder who built a subdivision that's still there today with restrictive covenants in the deeds of every home for whites only. And that's how California developed. Well, as I said, I promised I wouldn't go on forever. I could talk for 3 years about all this stuff, but these 2 policies are just a few of the many policies that federal, state, and local governments followed to create, enforce, and perpetuate racial segregation. And let me conclude with a couple of things. One, why it perpetuates it. Why does this matter today? We have a Fair Housing Act in 1968. Why hasn't that corrected this? And to understand why it hasn't corrected this, you have to think about the economics of the policies I've been describing. The homes I've described that were built in the mid-20th century, a federal government subsidy, sold at the time for $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. They were small homes, 750 square feet. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, that's about a little less than $100,000. So think of them as $100,000 homes that working-class families, white or black, could easily have afforded. But only whites were permitted to buy. Over the next couple of generations, those homes grew in value. Homes in Levittown now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. And the same thing is true of the other suburbs I mentioned. The white families who were permitted, subsidized to buy those homes gained over the next couple of generations $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in wealth, in equity. Middle-class families in this country gain what wealth they have from the equity they have in their homes. It's only the very wealthy who get wealth from the stock market or from saving. The rest of us get it from the wealth we have in our homes. And the middle-class white families started out as working class, but then the middle-class white families used this wealth to send their children to college. They used it to weather emergencies, whether they were economic or medical or other emergencies, and they used it to bequeath to their children so that their children would have down payments for homes, or their grandchildren would have down payments for homes. African Americans who were required by federal policy to remain as renters in either public housing or in the private market in urban areas gained none of that wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes are 60%, 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is only 10% of white wealth on average. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century that we've never remedied or attempted to remedy. We can prohibit, as we did in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, future discrimination. But once you have a wealth gap as large as we created, and once you have homes in suburban communities that are now selling for $600,000, not $100,000, simply prohibiting future discrimination doesn't do very much to desegregate the segregation that we as a country created, as our government created. So understanding this history, as I say, is necessary to begin to have the kinds of conversations nationally that are necessary to develop the commitment to reform, to desegregate, the will to reform, and the power to reform. As I mentioned before, I spent a lot of time as an education scholar, analyst, so you can understand that when I discovered all this history, one of the things I did before I wrote the book was I wanted to look and see how high schools and middle schools are teaching it today. And so I looked through all of the most commonly used American history textbooks in schools in this country today. And every one of them lies about it. The most commonly used American history textbook is something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages. In those 1,200 pages, there's one paragraph called Discrimination in the North. Within that paragraph, there's one sentence devoted to housing, and the sentence reads as follows. Something like this. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated housing. That's it. Passive voice sentence. They woke up one day, they looked out the window, and they said, hey, look, this is we're in a segregated neighborhood. This is a crime. This is a crime, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy as we've been. So I know many of you are lawyers or soon to be lawyers or other policy experts, but there's something we can all do as citizens to begin the process of reform, and that is to make sure that our high schools and middle schools are not misteaching this history, that they're teaching an accurate version of the de jure nature of residential segregation. And I guarantee you that if you start a conversation about how the schools where your children or nieces and nephews or grandchildren are going, how they're teaching it, you'll also start a conversation in the adult community as well. So I want to thank you for your attention.